Hello, this is John Richardson speaking with you from Toronto, Canada on January the 20th, 2001. Extremely important day in the United States. I, along with many others, watched President-elect Biden be sworn in as the 46th President of the United States. Tax policy is absolutely sure to be on the agenda, although perhaps not immediate. I predict there will be massive changes, and given that the Democrats have control of President, the House, and the Senate, this may actually be a very, very good time for the taxation of Americans abroad to be considered. We recently formed an organization, SEAT, acronym for Stop Extraterritorial American Taxation, along with Karen Alpert, Keith Redmond, Laura Sanders, David Johnston, and Suzanne Herman, with the sole purpose of educating and eventually contributing to ending U.S., what in the United States they would call citizenship-based taxation. But for those who understand it to be the U.S. policy of imposing worldwide taxation on people who are tax residents of other countries on their foreign income when these people have no connection to the United States. And today, we have most of the founding members of SEAT together to discuss why the number one problem is citizenship-based taxation, and along with that, why things like FATCA are actually expressions of that problem, and why solving the FATCA problem will not, in fact, solve the problem of citizenship-based taxation, which is part of our way of trying to unite the people affected by this and get them to focus on what the real problem is. So I welcome the members of SEAT. We have everybody here today with the exception of David Johnston, who I hope will be on our next call. Let me begin, and this is going to be sort of a round table type of discussion. Let me begin with Karen Alpert, who is in Australia. Karen, can you explain why citizenship-based taxation is a problem, what it means to people in real life, and why, at least beginning the discussion, why getting rid of things like FATCA and all these other things will not solve the problem of citizenship-based taxation?
Okay, thanks, John. So the idea behind the U.S. tax system is that it's based on citizenship rather than residence, which means that if you move outside of the U.S., and I'm talking a permanent move, not a 5-year, secondment out to a different branch of your U.S. company. But if you permanently move to another country, you want to set up roots there. You want to open your bank accounts there. You want to maybe start saving for retirement where you live, buy a house, all these things. Once you've moved out of any other country in the world, you're no longer a tax resident of that country. But if you're a U.S. citizen, then you're a tax resident of the U.S. regardless of where you live. You can't sever your tax residence just by moving. It's not just. It's an actual change in the country where your economic interests are focused. And when you do that for any other country, you're no longer taxed by them. For the U.S., you continue to be taxed. However, on top of that, the U.S. tax code really dislikes anything that's foreign, so outside of the U.S. So here you are, the U.S. insists on taxing your worldwide income, but anything that you buy where you live is non-U.S. and taxed punitively. So this is a real problem for people who are emigrating from the U.S. And I don't think anyone in the U.S. really understands how much of a problem this can be. But they have this idea that it's rich people that move to the Bahamas or whatever to avoid U.S. taxes, and that's not, that's just the tiniest fraction of U.S. immigrants. Most are normal middle class, sometimes lower middle class. They've moved over to another country, because they have relatives there, because they've met someone and gotten married, whatever. They're not rich, but they can't really establish themselves in the new country financially because of the lingering ties of US taxation. Now, in the past, what happened is people like that who actually emigrated from the US would basically stop filing, and nobody knew, nobody cared. Um, not some Didn't seem to be so much of an issue until the US started trying to enforce the citizenship-based taxation, and that's basically what FATCA is doing for us. They're trying. It's the U.S. way of trying to enforce this citizenship-based taxation. So if you get rid of citizenship-based taxation, you get rid of the reason for requiring non-residents of the U.S. to give social security numbers to their banks, and that will get rid of most of the banking problems that people are having at the moment due to FATCA. I hope that covered what you wanted to cover.
Well,
John.
that sure covered an awful lot of stuff. But if we could perhaps, summarize in a couple of relatively simple sentences. So, what I understand you to be saying is that the problem of this so-called citizenship-based taxation is that people who leave the United States are always subject to U.S. taxation, even if they become a tax resident of another country. So the problem is they're simultaneously subject to two different tax systems, right?
Right.
That's point one. And point number two is, I think what you were saying was that FATCA doesn't actually create a tax liability. It's just a way to find a way to enforce citizenship-based taxation, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's go over to Suzanne for a moment. So Karen makes the point that the problem for at least long-term residents outside the United States is they're subject simultaneously to both the U.S. tax system, which Karen makes the point hates anything foreign, and the tax system of the country where they live. So Suzanne, you would presumably agree, as painful as it may be, that you're subject to both the U.S. and Canadian tax systems?
Absolutely. And I
And I
think that
wonder if you
there's,
could outline some of the problems that causes you.
I think that there is this presumption by a lot of people in the United States that the U.S. is taxing us while we live in other countries on U.S. income. When the vast majority of us don't have U.S. sourced income. All our income is earned where we live. We have equity in our homes that the U.S. will tax us on if we exceed the deductions for it. And that's not difficult to do in a day and age of soaring real estate prices. So it's income earned solely in the countries where we live. And I think that's I think a lot of people would find that extremely unfair.
So to be clear, what you're saying is the way the U.S. tax system operates, if you're a U.S. citizen, whatever that may be, is that if you're a tax resident of another country, living in that country, say Canada, that all of your non-U.S., your Canadian income is subject to taxation by the United States, right?
Yes, the income, it has no economic connection to the United States in the vast majority of cases.
But not only that, but it's subject to taxation according to specific U.S. tax rules that seem to penalize anything that's not U.S., correct?
Exactly, because it's viewed as foreign income. And the United States doesn't like anything foreign.
Interesting. Karen, can we come back to you for just 1 second to comment on Suzanne's point? Can you add to or elaborate her point that the United States really is hostile towards non-U.S. or foreign, in this case, Canadian income?
Yeah, well, I think that the most egregious point is the way the U.S. treats mutual funds, or as we call them down here, managed funds. So I can go to Fidelity Australia and buy an ETF that's domiciled in Australia, and the US will treat that as foreign. On the other hand, if I buy an ETF that is domiciled in the US, it may have exactly the same investments, but because it's domiciled in the US, it's no longer foreign. What's the consequence of my buying a foreign Australian, where I live, ETF or managed fund? The consequence is that I no longer get capital gains treatment on anything. Every bit of income from that is number one, taxed as ordinary income, and number two, either taxed when it's earned, or I pay interest for not paying tax when I say earned, when we have unrealized appreciation. So when the value of the fund goes up, that gets taxed immediately by the US if it's a foreign fund. It doesn't get to be deferred until I actually realize the gain. Or if I don't do that, I pay daily compounded interest on.
Carol, let's get into that. Let's get into the details, the weeds on that, perhaps in another podcast. But would you agree with the following statement in conjunction with the U.S. taxation of non-U.S. mutual funds, that they've essentially created a brand new kind of tax for that situation that homeland Americans who own U.S. mutual funds would never be subject to? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's a completely confiscatory tax on owning. The idea is that if you're an American, you shouldn't be owning any managed funds or mutual funds outside the U.S. Well, I'm sorry, I live outside the U.S.
Yeah, not only the managed funds, but it's coming back to Suzanne. What happens if you have a small business corporation in Canada, Canadian small business? Do they have special rules for that as well?
Certainly. Yeah, it's foreign. Why would you, as an American, own a business outside the U.S.? So
but you live outside the U.S.
Are completely written from the point of view of somebody living inside the U.S. And then they say, oh, but we don't want rich people to be able to move away and avoid our taxes, so we're going to tax citizens, regardless of where they live. And they don't really put the two pieces together and say, oh, that means that if somebody's running a hairdressing salon in Vancouver, we're going to tax that at just the same as Apple opening up a subsidiary in Vancouver. I mean, this just doesn't
they actually presume that it's for a nefarious reason of tax avoidance. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. Well, that's what the forms are doing. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, speaking of forms and that, which when I hear the word form, I immediately think of the word penalty, which makes me think of Laura, who wrote a very interesting paper for Tax Notes a while back. I think it was called The Criminalization of the American Expat. Have I got that right?
The criminalization of the American immigrant.
I beg your pardon. Huge distinction. I apologize. Absolutely. The criminalization of the American immigrant. And, I read your paper with great interest, but didn't a lot of that paper talk about these problems and the forms and the penalties associated with something as what you would call criminal, of, using a Canadian corporation to carry on a Canadian business if you live in Canada?
Yeah, yes, the paper gets into a fair amount of detail about all the various ways that the U.S. tax rules criminalize people who live, American citizens who live outside the United States on a long-term basis.
And could you come up with just a few quick examples?
Well, you've spoken about a fair number of them just now.
Well, they don't. Maybe we'll just go through some of these carefully. But we've talked about the foreign corporation. I think Suzanne's had some experience with that. We've talked about the mutual funds. It sounds like Karen knows something about that. Are you aware of people who've had these foreign trust problems, who've had some kind of benign family trust outside the United States who's been hit with penalties? Anybody's aware of that?
Or retirement.
Yeah, that affected, well, I don't think we're sure exactly how many people were affected by that, but probably several thousand who did not file an informational form by a really very confusing deadline, so confusing that a lot of these people who actually work with professional tax practitioners, they didn't understand the deadline. And because they didn't file an informational form, again, by a very confusing deadline, they got hit with a $10,000 penalties, in some cases more than $10,000.
Absolutely. Not only did they not understand the deadline, but the form itself is so confusing that many people don't understand the form. But I mean, when we think about the extraordinary scope of this, it applies to anybody who is defined as a U.S. citizen living outside the United States, including, to bring Keith into the conversation, people who don't even speak English. Is that correct, Keith?
That is correct. There's a number of people whose first language is definitely not English, or they don't speak English whatsoever. And it's tough enough when English is your native tongue to be able to go through these forms, but when you don't even speak the language, it is absolutely impossible.
But yet they're still subject to the same penalty regime.
That is correct.
Coming back to Suzanne for a second. Suzanne, I once heard you make an interesting comment that people who were taxed residents of the United States and another country actually got the worst of both sets of countries' tax rules. Do you agree with that, Suzanne?
I think so. Yes, absolutely. Yes, we do. Contrary to what people think, we're double taxed on many things, as Karen has pointed out, or we can't make investments as other people living in Canada and people living in the United States can make. So we're sort of penalized for being a citizen of one place that has citizenship-based taxation, obviously, and living in another. Beyond that, you might want to take it from there, John.
Well, if we look, for example, at the whole issue of the Canadian-controlled private corporations in Canada. Canada has high tax rates, and one of the reasons that people use Canadian-controlled private corporations is, basically as private pension plans, perfectly legal, reasonable, and advisable in the Canadian tax system. But U.S. citizens who have those are subject to U.S. tax rules that essentially prevent the deferral of income, right? So they are deprived of the opportunity for rational tax planning in Canada, and they are hit with confiscatory U.S. taxes that apply even without any money having been earned, right? Because what's happening is the individual has to pay the tax earned by the corporation. So, this can be, really a gigantic problem. Now, Keith.
Well, what was really shocking was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the retroactive tax. That's for
Tell me
the
more
whole time.
about that. Did you use the word retroactive?
Well, the transition tax.
The one where they put a present tax on earnings that were previously not taxable from 1986. That's what you're talking about?
Exactly. And we'd reported this corporation for years and years. It's a solely Canadian operated corporation, earns all its money in Canada.
Where would you report the corporation? Is that on one of these forms?
That's right. So if I hadn't reported the corporation, they wouldn't have known about it. And, you avoid a lot of problems by not filing at all. But in our case, we did file. We've been filing for several years since we got swept up in the whole compliance effort that the United States had made through FATCA and whatnot.
I think Suzanne makes a really good point. A lot of people will say, look, just don't comply, that'll avoid the problem. But there's something immoral about laws that require people to break the law in order to live a normal life.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, that is interesting. I mean, Keith, you're running that Facebook group with, as far as I can see, a very, very large membership,
Yes.
um, populated primarily by just sort of everyday people. Is this sort of what the general view on this is? That compliance is perhaps more risky than non-compliance?
That seems to be the trend, especially when there's more onerous laws put on the books, like Suzanne was just talking about, that was part of the TCGA. And, Suzanne is almost like a poster child for people, what happens to people who actually try to follow the law. And pardon my French, but they get screwed. So people look at that and state, well, why should I even comply if I'm going to lose my shirt?
Well, the answer from the compliance industry, would be, because it's the law, right? I mean, the compliance industry, um, we have FATCA, right, to enforce this. But my personal view of this is that the compliance industry, that so much of U.S. tax compliance has just been downloaded to the compliance industry, and I'd be interested to get Laura's perspective on this, that to a very large extent, the compliance industry is sort of the private enforcement contractor for the IRS. Would you agree with that, Laura?
I think that the IRS is basically is more or less stated openly that that's its policy today, to use tax practitioners as their compliance or enforcement force, because the IRS doesn't have the resources to do it themselves.
Hmm. Um, and if they don't do it properly, Karen, I need your help on this, but there is such a thing as preparer penalties, isn't there?
Oh yeah, yeah, and so the preparers are going to be very conservative, by which I mean they're going to report everything that might possibly have to be reported. I
Mhm.
think we need to really um, emphasize the fact that because we mentioned it briefly earlier, FATCA is only a compliance, uh, a way to get compliance with these laws, and all of this discussion has really showed us how unreasonable the U.S. taxation of non-resident citizens can be. Um, but I think we need to make the point that that's the main problem, is this citizenship-based taxation, and that things like FATCA and FBARs and the penalties, etc., those would all pretty much go away if the U.S. would stop taxing people who have emigrated from the U.S.
Well, clearly they would. There's no doubt about it. Now, why do you think? I mean, it's pretty obvious to me, having been sort of an observer of this for a long time, that the only people who understand this are the people who've had to live it. Why, for
Absolutely.
example, why is it that I do not believe that most of the tax practitioners understand this. Believe it or not, I don't think they understand it. Do you think I'm right on that?
You're absolutely right. I've had to
John,
talk to
I
tax
think
practitioners and tell them what they don't understand. And it's like a light that goes on for them. So, absolutely.
John, I think that there are many people who consider themselves real experts on the American tax system, far beyond what the average tax practitioner would consider themselves to be. And they have no idea about these issues. And if you suggest to them that maybe it's something they should look at or that there are problems, their instinctive reaction most of the time is to deny it, and not take the time to look at it, just to deny that there's a problem. But I think the number of people that don't fit what I just described is so small you can count it on one hand.
Meaning the number of people who do understand it?
Yes, meaning the number of people who are really are real experts on the American tax system, are recognized as being experts on the American tax system, and who understand the issues, the international issues. That number is extremely small.
Yet, most of the tax preparation work on behalf of Americans abroad, be they expats or be they immigrants or be they accidentals, uh, seems to me to be done by people who really don't get it.
Well, I think the longer I spend studying these issues, I think that from an intellectual perspective, it's very difficult to be in both places. It's very difficult intellectually to be in the compliance and the practitioner camp, and also be in the recognizing the problems, understanding that drastic changes are needed camp. I think that intellectually they're really incompatible with each other, because if you're working to actually, make sure people are complying with their obligations, first of all, that's an enormous amount of intellectual space and energy just to understand the rules and to apply them, and to work with people to apply them, and to understand how the forms work, etc. So how can you, at the same time you're doing that, step away from that? Because you must step completely away from that in order to look at the bigger picture of what all of this really means for people as individuals, for Americans who want to live overseas, for the countries in which they live in, and to fully grasp the problems that it causes. How do you go back and forth between those two camps? I think except for a very small number of people, it's almost impossible to do that.
So what you're saying is that for your average tax practitioner, just understanding the rules from a U.S. point of view, when they get there, they say, "Oh my God, I'm all full. I don't have room left to understand anything else." Is that right?
There's that, and there's also, if you truly understood the damage that this causes, then you would have to understand your role in promulgating that damage. And once you understand that, then you've lost your living.
Well, yeah,
Mhm.
on that subject, their billing, at least in our case, our accountant's billing goes up every year with all the new layers of compliance, especially with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's ridiculous how much you're paying a practitioner to do your taxes.
Well,
If
the
you're a
amount
U.S.
may be
citizen.
high, but given the time it takes to understand the situation and do it, I'm not sure. But this is another point that I think needs to be made, that even the most simple U.S. tax returns are expensive to get somebody to do. What is it, Keith? You might have a better handle on this than any of the rest of us. What do these things generally start at to find somebody to do your taxes?
Um, Boy, it can range. For a very simple tax return outside the United States, it can easily average to $1,000. But I've known people who have had a little bit more of a complicated return, have paid anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 easily.
Is this tax deductible, Karen?
Where? So your
Well,
U.S. tax preparation, if you itemize, which very few people will, then it would be, some of it could be, but for the most part, no. And certainly my U.S. tax preparation was not deductible on my Australian tax return, and my Australian
so
tax
the answer
preparation.
is no, basically. Unless it's
So yeah,
deductible in
basically
both
no.
places, it's not for practical purposes deductible, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. You know, this is, I sort of, so we talk about this, and I realize that everybody on this call knows a good deal about it, but I also know that even after having listened to the discussion, that a lot of tax preparers would be in complete denial. They'd say, no, 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 you're confused. You're wrong. They'd say, well, doesn't the foreign earned income exclusion mean you don't pay any tax, or the foreign tax credits? Very, very quickly, I think we all agree that's not true, but very quickly, why is that?
Look, the
Well,
foreign earned income exclusion doesn't help because not all income is earned.
So, in other
So
words, if
that's,
you're getting welfare benefits, that it doesn't help you.
it doesn't help with that. It doesn't help with your retirement accounts, your investments, all those things.
And somebody
Once
brief
you
me,
retire, you're
why
not
is it
earning.
the foreign tax credit rules won't wipe out the tax necessarily?
Oh, often the timing is different. the US is taxing things before or after they're being taxed elsewhere, usually before. Sometimes the US is taxing phantom income, like foreign exchange gains, because the myth that everything has to be in US dollars.
And if it's phantom income, what you're really saying is that it's taxable in the US, but not taxable in the other country. And since it's not taxable in the other country, no foreign tax paid to offset US tax, right?
Exactly.
Okay. One final thing before we wrap up this fascinating session would be this, and we'll make this a separate podcast. But maybe somebody can comment on, the tax treaty that countries sign with the United States actually incorporates the legitimacy of this into the treaty. How does that work?
Absolutely. That's the saving clause that the US puts in all of their tax treaties.
And in
That
one or
basically
two
says
sentences, what does that mean?
it basically says that the US has reserves the right to tax their citizens as if the treaty did not exist.
And then it provides a few exceptions.
It provides, a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, what it's saying is the US has the right to tax their citizens based on citizenship, and the other country is agreeing to it.
Shocking, shocking, shocking. So in other words, the other country is really agreeing for the US to impose worldwide taxation on their own residents, on their own tax residents, according to
And
US
their own
tax law.
citizens, because most of the ones who are affected the worst are dual citizens.
Right. All right. In wrapping this up, main point though is this, and I'm going to ask a question. I like to go around the group and answer it. We all hate FATCA. We all hate FBAR. But will ending FATCA and FBAR end the problem of citizenship-based taxation? Let's go around the group, starting with Karen. Yes or no?
Absolutely not. Look, FATCA has made everybody aware of this U.S. policy. Getting rid of FATCA is not getting rid of the obligation to file U.S. tax returns. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's not going to fix it.
And for those who don't know what a genie is, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Laura, will getting rid of FATCA and FBAR end the problem of citizenship taxation?
I think it's obvious that it will not. And I think it's also obvious that going forward, whenever anyone discusses these issues, they need to not talk about FATCA as if it was taxation, but be precise in the language that they use, not mix them up when they shouldn't be mixed up.
Suzanne, would your life in Canada change dramatically if there were no FATCA?
Canada hasn't been hit as hard as other countries because they're not yet closing bank accounts of people who don't have social security numbers. But I, of course, have a social security number and I report my bank account. So it's just it's the fact that my accounts are being reported without any sort of.
But it won't end the
citizenship
taxation problem, right?
No, of course, no, it wouldn't. And if we don't get rid of CBT, U.S. lawmakers, because they're completely unaware of the laws that they're passing and how they affect us, they could just throw another one at us next year, like they threw the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act at us, a couple of years ago. So,
taxation, CBT, is really, to use the words of David Johnston, who's a member of CEAP but not with us today, is the original sin. And I'd like to close with Keith. Keith, would you describe citizenship taxation? Is a very nondescript term, makes it sound like it's almost patriotic. Could you describe citizenship taxation, a better cluster of words that describes what it really is?
Sure. And I got this from you, John, that the citizenship-based taxation is the U.S. imposing its tax code outside the U.S. on tax residents of other countries. That's what it is, bottom line. You can dress it up to make it sound patriotic or not, but the bottom line is that's what the U.S. is doing.
Well, you may have gotten it from me, but you've certainly perfected it. Thank you very much for that. All right, everybody, that's been a really, really good discussion. I thank you very much for that. And this is the first of a number of podcasts that I hope that the core members of SEAT can continue doing as part of our educational mission. So thank you so much for participating in this today. And again,
Thanks, John.
we are members of SEAT, Stop Extraterritorial American Taxation. You can find our site, seatnow.org, SEATNOW.org. Thank you very much.